We often get asked how we go about making a landscape level plan to manage fuels and, unfortunately, fires in the landscape we live in. It's a big landscape. You know, the question comes up, where do you start? And when we were doing it, we ended up realizing there were some fairly straightforward principles involved. We quickly came to the understanding, based on our extensive work in fuel management on the ground, that you have to be able to get to an area to work in it. Areas that are inaccessible or have no developed access just don't work for a fuel management area. We can't get crews and machinery onto the site to do the job. So access is a key consideration when we're doing the planning. We just have to be able to get there. The next thing that we, of course, realized is that the area has to be operable. It has to have a gentle enough slope that we can use our ground-based crews where appropriate. We want to be able to use mechanized approaches because of the cost efficiencies and the fact we can cover a lot more area and get a lot more of the job done. And we don't work on ecologically sensitive areas with extremely steep slopes and shallow soils. Our landscape is dominated by fairly steep slopes to very steep slopes, rocky cliffs in places, sites that just say, no, this isn't part of it. When you take those out, you're suddenly looking at a much smaller section of your land base that you can conceivably work on. The strategic fuel break should expand outwards from treated areas, areas with low fuels, or areas with no fuels wherever possible. We use those as anchor points for the strategic fuel breaks. And of course, another key consideration is that the areas that we treat have to be big enough to make a difference. A little 3-hectare postage stamp size treatment isn't going to affect the behavior of fire in the landscape. Fire will burn around it, jump over it, or burn through it. It's not going to have a significant impact. We're looking for areas that are 200 to 500 meters wide and certainly at least that long, preferably a kilometer or more long. Substantial portions of the landscape where we can manage fuels to reduce fire behavior, increase the chances of suppression, and generally break our community forest landscape into units that fire can be contained within. The strategic fuel breaks should consider ecosystem restoration potential or needs wherever possible. We have ecosystems that were historically maintained by frequent fires here in the valley. We want to work in those ecosystems to bring back that fire regime, reduce fuels, and effectively help expand our strategic fuel break in the area. We turned to our fire behavior modeling work and said, well, where do we think the fires are going to try to go based on the science and our best analysis of the situation? Well, those are then the places that we want to do fuel management work. The strategic fuel breaks have to be located to interrupt identified fire movement paths, to break up the landscape into units to help prevent small fires from growing into very large fires that will threaten ecology, infrastructure, homes, all the values that we're considering. So, the guiding principles behind the location of the strategic fuel breaks were: the treatment areas have to be accessible for the crews and for fuel management harvesting operations. The strategic fuel breaks have to be located to interrupt identified fire movement paths. Our goal is to break the landscape up into subunits. Fuel management treatments are only really feasible on slopes less than 60%. The strategic fuel breaks should be at least 200 meters wide and preferably wider. The strategic fuel breaks should expand outwards from areas of low fuels or no fuels wherever possible. The strategic fuel breaks should consider ecosystem restoration needs. The next thing that we realized is that we needed a good understanding of how fire moves in the landscape that we manage. We asked experts. We turned to Bob Gray, a fire expert, and he suggested we use FLAMAP, a tool from the USDA that can model fire behavior in complicated landscapes.
What I think is really cool about FlamMap is that it's a computer program that allows you to input data into the program, and then you can literally light virtual fires and see what the fire would do in reality if the conditions that you input in the system were actually to happen. So for example, you could choose a time of year, for example, August 10th. It's hot, it's 35 degrees, it's been 35 degrees for the last 10 days. The soil is dry, we haven't had any moisture. You input into the program the aspects, the direction that the mountain's facing, whether it's a south-facing slope or west-facing slope or east-facing slope. You can also input the fuel types, what kind of trees are there. We're using the data that we've been collecting over the years so that the computer knows the type of trees, the amount, the type of fuel that's on the ground. And then you can also input things as like the wind direction. On that particular day, there's a 16-kilometer wind that's coming from the west. And once you've inputted all of the data into the system, you can literally light a virtual fire, and then you'll see what happens. The rate of spread, where the fire is going to be after an hour, whether the fire is going to go or not go, and where it's going to be after 2 hours and 3 hours, and how it's going to travel. This gives you an idea as to fire behavior in these types of fuel types and aspects and conditions on any given time of the year. Then you can ask the computer to randomly ignite a certain amount of ignition. So the computer is going to travel and randomly start igniting fires. Let's say you say ignite 150 different fires in this zone. What that gives you is you start to see pattern emerging in the landscape, basically. You start to see that most fires tend to turn right here. They hit this valley wall and they turn right and travel this way. Another thing that's very interesting with FlamMap is sometimes you light virtual fires and the fire actually barely goes anywhere. It might burn for half an hour and then peters out. You often see that happening on north-facing slopes, places that have a lot of moisture. And then on the other end of the scale, sometimes you'll light a fire and within 8 hours it's burned hundreds and hundreds of hectares. And the difference between the two is very stark. And that can help you focus where you do your treatments. After we've ignited literally thousands of fires over the land base, we've started to be able to recognize what we call main fire corridors. You can go into these corridors and input landscape-sized fuel breaks. For example, you could say this is a main fire corridor that travels this way. We're gonna do a 50-hectare fuel treatment intercepting this main fire corridor. Then you can run FlamMap again and you can see how the fire behavior has changed because you've now inputted a new treated area. So you can start to develop a landscape level plan that has a series of landscape sized fuel breaks, and you can run the program again and see if you've made an impact on fire behavior, fire rate of spread, and the likelihood of mega fires happening in the landscape.
Everyone seems to agree that broad-scale, intense fires are bad for the ecosystem. They're natural, but they aren't desirable. Places that would burn a century ago, 2 centuries ago, places that were deliberately burnt in that time frame, burned with relatively low intensity fires which many trees lived through. We see situations now where there won't be a low intensity fire. It's going to be hot and destructive. Using FlamMap lets us model these situations, study them, make predictions, and make management plans that consider and respect fire behavior, and allows us to work towards a fuel management program to alter fire behavior we don't want to see in our tenure or in our watersheds. So we see the benefits of using the model are that we can experiment, we can learn, all in the safety of a computer model, to make better management choices on our landscape.
One of the things that's really amazing about FlamMap is it makes it very real for residents. You can actually map a fire and say, given these types of condition, if there was a fire that would start in this location, which is identified as one of the likely areas that a fire could start, then within 6 hours the fire is going to be this size. This fire is going to have passed through your home and is going to have moved 2 kilometers down the valley. It allows people to create a relationship with what actually happens when fire happens and how quickly they can move. And it's a really amazing tool for getting public support for the work of wildfire mitigation.
We haven't had a lot of real-world tests, thank God, but the few ignitions we have had since we started this modeling process several years ago have by and large behaved the way the model suggested they would. We don't see that as absolute proof, but it's gratifying reassurance that we aren't wildly out in left field with this process. So the benefit for us is strategic level planning. It's a huge factor in our tenure and stewardship in the community forest, and it has guided what we plan on doing in the next decade or so as we move into a climate change adaptation management regime.